Daniel always believed that if you kept your head down and did good work, things would eventually work out. It wasn't a glamorous mindset, but it was consistent. For 6 years, he showed up to the same office, sat at the same desk, and quietly became the person everyone relied on when something broke. He wasn't the loudest in meetings, and he didn't chase attention, but if a system failed or a deadline looked impossible, people turned to him. That was his role, the steady one, the invisible backbone. And for a long time, that was enough. But everything changed the day Ryan arrived. Ryan was different from the start. Younger, sharper in appearance, confident in a way that felt rehearsed. He spoke in polished sentences, used buzzwords like strategy and optimization, and had a way of making simple ideas sound complicated. Within a week, he had already begun reshaping the team, introducing new processes, new expectations, and most noticeably, a new hierarchy. At the top of that hierarchy was Ryan. At the bottom, whether intentionally or not, was Daniel. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was small things. Daniel would find out about meetings after they had already happened. Projects he had started would suddenly be reassigned for efficiency. Ideas he had shared in private would resurface in group discussions, presented by Ryan as if they were his own. Daniel noticed it, of course. He wasn't naive. But he told himself it wasn't worth reacting to. Office politics came and went. Managers rotated. If he just kept doing what he always did, eventually things would stabilize. Except they didn't. Over the next few months, the gap between perception and reality began to grow. To upper management, Ryan looked like a rising star. Metrics were improving, reports were clean, and everything appeared to be running smoothly. But behind the scenes, it was Daniel holding everything together, quietly fixing issues before they escalated, patching over rushed decisions, and preventing small mistakes from becoming major problems. The problem was, no one saw that part. And Ryan made sure of it. Then came the project that changed everything. It was a major system overhaul, something the company had been planning for years. Ryan pushed aggressively to get it done faster than scheduled. He wanted results, and more importantly, he wanted recognition. To him, this project wasn't just work, it was leverage. Daniel, on the other hand, saw the risks immediately. The system wasn't ready. There were safeguards in place for a reason, and rushing the process meant those safeguards would either be weakened or removed entirely. At first, Daniel tried to raise concerns in meetings. He spoke carefully, outlining potential issues without sounding confrontational. But every time he spoke, Ryan would respond with confidence, brushing off the concerns as overly cautious thinking. Progress requires risk, he'd say. We can't afford to move slowly. And because Ryan sounded sure of himself, people believed him. So the project moved forward. Faster and faster. Until one morning, Daniel noticed something that didn't make sense. A critical alert hadn't triggered. Under normal circumstances, it should have lit up every dashboard in the system. It was designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of failure they were now at risk of experiencing. But it hadn't gone off. Daniel dug deeper. What he found made his stomach drop. Ryan had overridden parts of the system. Quietly, intentionally. He had disabled certain protections to speed up deployment and make the project appear more successful than it actually was. On the surface, everything looked fine. Underneath, it was unstable. Daniel knew what that meant. If left unchecked, the system wouldn't just fail. It would fail in a way that cost the company millions. So he made a decision. He documented everything. Carefully, methodically, every change, every override, every timeline. He didn't jump to conclusions, and he didn't accuse anyone directly. He simply laid out the facts and sent them through the proper channels. Private, professional, responsible. For a brief moment, he believed he had done the right thing. Until Friday. The meeting was scheduled late in the afternoon. That alone felt strange. By then, most people were already winding down for the weekend. When Daniel walked into the room, he immediately sensed something was off. Ryan was already there. So was someone from HR. The tone shifted before anyone even spoke. Ryan didn't look nervous. He looked prepared. What followed didn't feel like a conversation. It felt like a script. Daniel was accused of creating instability within the team, of undermining leadership, of raising concerns in a way that disrupted progress. The very report he had submitted was reframed as evidence of negativity, of resistance to change. And then came the final twist. Ryan suggested that Daniel himself had contributed to the system issues. Not directly, but through mismanagement and lack of alignment. Daniel sat there, listening, realizing in real time what was happening. This wasn't about solving a problem. This was about removing a threat. 6 years of work, reduced to a narrative that fit someone else's ambition. The decision had already been made. By the time the meeting ended, Daniel was no longer an employee. Security escorted him back to his desk. He packed his things in silence. No one really knew what to say, and most people avoided eye contact altogether. And just like that, he was gone. For the next few days, Daniel did nothing. Not out of defeat, but out of clarity. He replayed everything in his mind, not emotionally, but analytically. Every interaction, every shift in behavior, every decision that led to that moment. And the more he thought about it, the more one thing became obvious. This wasn't just unfair. It was unsustainable. Because the system Ryan had pushed through was still broken. And now, there was no one left to quietly fix it. Daniel didn't act immediately. He didn't post anything online, didn't send angry emails, didn't try to defend himself publicly. Instead, he waited. 3 weeks passed. And right on schedule, things started to fall apart. At first, it was subtle. Minor delays, small inconsistencies in data, nothing catastrophic but enough to raise questions. Then the issues began to stack. Clients started noticing discrepancies. Reports didn't match expectations. Deadlines slipped. Internally, pressure started building. Ryan tried to maintain control. He reassured leadership that everything was under control, that the issues were temporary, that the system just needed time to stabilize. But the problems didn't stabilize. They multiplied. Because the safeguards that had been removed were never replaced. And without Daniel there to compensate for them, the weaknesses were exposed. Upper management started asking harder questions. Not just what was happening, but why. That's when Daniel made his move. He didn't go to social media. He didn't reach out to former coworkers. He went directly to the board. Not with emotion. With evidence. A complete breakdown of events, timelines, system logs, documentation that clearly showed what had been changed, when it had been changed, and by whom. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't speculate. He simply presented the truth. And this time, there was no one to spin it. Within days, the tone inside the company shifted. Meetings were held behind closed doors. External consultants were brought in. The narrative that had once protected Ryan began to collapse under the weight of actual data. And then, just as quietly as Daniel had been removed, Ryan disappeared. No announcement, no explanation. One day he was there. The next he was. But the damage he left behind remained. The system was still unstable, the losses were real, and the company now faced a problem it couldn't ignore. Because the person who understood the system better than anyone else was gone. It didn't take long for them to realize that. At first, they tried to fix things internally. Then they brought in outside help. But no matter what they did, they kept running into the same issue. They didn't understand how everything connected. Because Daniel had been the one who built those connections. Eventually, they reached a conclusion they couldn't avoid. They needed him back. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Daniel let it ring once before answering. The voice on the other end was careful, polite, very different from the tone he remembered from that Friday meeting. They explained the situation, acknowledged that mistakes had been made, offered him a position. Higher salary, better title, more authority. This time, they made it clear. He wouldn't just be part of the system. He would control it. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't react. When they finished, he paused. Not because he needed time to think, but because he wanted them to feel it. The silence, the weight of what they were asking. He thanked them for the offer and told them he'd get back to them. For the next 2 days, he said nothing. He let them wait. Let them sit with the uncertainty. The same uncertainty he had felt when everything was taken from him without warning. Then, on Thursday afternoon, he called back and accepted, but not as the same person who had been walked out weeks earlier. This time, he returned on his terms. New contract, new structure, full control over the systems he had once quietly maintained. When Daniel walked back into the building, everything felt different. Not because the place had changed, but because his position in it had. People noticed him now. Meetings waited for him. Decisions required his input. And for the first time, there was no one above him taking credit for what he built. He didn't celebrate, didn't make a speech. He just sat down and got to work. Because for Daniel, it was never about revenge in the way people usually think. It wasn't about anger or proving someone wrong. It was about something much simpler. Balance. He had been pushed out for doing the right thing. And in the end, that same truth brought him back. Only this time, there was no one left to take it from him.